In this series of lessons, we're going to be looking into wireless networking. Wireless networking is one of the most rapidly growing areas of network communications. It's simple and inexpensive to assemble, to modify, to disassemble and relocate and reassemble a wireless network. Wireless networking is cheap and easy because it doesn't require a wired infrastructure like Ethernet does. In Ethernet networking, before you could establish the network communications, you'd have to run all sorts of Ethernet cables throughout the building. And this was costly and time-consuming and presented an investment in that specific facility. In wireless networking, you have a very inexpensive wireless access point, and only the access points need a back-end wired infrastructure to connect into the corporate network, the resources, and perhaps even the internet. So the wired infrastructure is substantially reduced when it comes to a wireless network. One of the early issues with wireless networking is that the bandwidth was low. Originally, the bandwidth was at 2 megabits and then moved to 11 megabits, then 54 megabits, and today we're approaching hundreds of megabits and even gigabits in our wireless networking. So the throughput is growing rapidly. It's a wonderful thing. However, because wireless networking is nothing but emanations, these are electromagnetic waves propagating through the air, bad guys can intercept those radio frequency communications and can steal your data. So there still is an increased security concern. Also, the bad guy doesn't need to be within your facility to attach to your wireless network like he had to in the early days of wired networking, Ethernet. He literally had to plug his cable into your infrastructure back in those days. With wireless networking, he can be across the street or down the block, or a bad guy with a good antenna can even be miles away and still connect to your wireless network. So there are still substantial security concerns, and we'll be addressing those later in this series of lessons. Now, the wireless network typically relies on two primary components: the wireless access point, which provides the infrastructure for the wireless network. This is typically attached to the wired infrastructure that hosts the corporate resources, the servers and other communications. And then the other side of this is the client side. And typically this is simply a wireless network interface card that is very inexpensive these days. And we'll call this the wireless NIC. Now, we have different scales or sizes of wireless networks. The first one is the personal area network. Personal area network typically is considered to be about a 10-meter radius. This is about 33 feet. And so this personal area network is typically going to operate using Bluetooth or perhaps even something called Zigbee, which is a super low power wireless communications mechanism. So that's for personal area network, about 10 meters radius. The next size network we're going to look at is the local area network. Now this includes a large family of IEEE 802.11 specifications. And this would be the 802.11b, G, A, N, and AC. Now those last two, 802.11n and 802.11ac, are the newer multiple input, multiple output technologies that are getting us great distances and fantastic data rates. And then finally we have the metropolitan area network and the wide area network using wireless communications. And again, here we'll use that MIMO, that multiple input, multiple output technology. A similar but competing technology is called WiMAX. And then also our 4G cellular networks as they evolve. We're still not quite at 4G cellular in the true sense. As 4G cellular evolves, we'll be utilizing that 4G cellular network for metropolitan area networks and wide area network communications. Now, this is the IEEE 802.11 series of specifications. These are the primary ones. There are others, but these are the primary ones that we need to be familiar with for wireless networking. The original specification was 802.11, as I said, provides about 2 megabits of throughput, data throughput, and it operated at 2.4 gigahertz. 802.11b, still in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency range, added a new technology called direct sequence spread spectrum and got us up to about 11 megabits. Then both the 802.11a and G added something called orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. This got us to a much higher data rate of 54 megabits. Now, the primary difference between A and G are that the 802.11g specification still operates in that 2.4 gigahertz frequency range, but the 802.11a operates at 5 gigahertz. This is a more isolated frequency spectrum, and there's not so much interference in that 5 gigahertz frequency range. The kicker, though, is you need specifically 802.11a access points or transmitters and receivers and 802.11a wireless network interface cards with all the clients in order to get that 802.11a network running. Now, the next standard down is 802.11i. With the original 802.11, they implemented wired equivalent privacy, WEP. Now, that was the security component of 802.11, the original wireless specification. 802.11i is the repair or the replacement for that failed, very vulnerable wired equivalent privacy in WEP. The 802.11i is the specification. However, in implementation, the vendors produce something called Wi-Fi Protected Access and Wi-Fi Protected Access version 2, WPA and WPA2. These are the repair components for the security flaws in wired equivalent privacy, the original security component for wireless networks. Now, as we said, 802.11n and 802.11ac are the new guys on the block. These guys use multiple transmitters and multiple receivers and multiple antenna to increase the data rates, upwards of hundreds of megabits, perhaps even approaching gigabits of throughput. And not just 100 meters or so, these go hundreds of meters and perhaps even miles or even tens of miles as this further develops. So watch for these MIMO 802.11n and 802.11ac technologies to evolve, and they're evolving rapidly. These are coming into the commercial world as we speak. And then finally, I'll mention these bottom two, 802.11h and 802.11j. As we implemented wireless networking standards here in the United States, we bumped into some conflicting standards in other countries and nations, and as a result, there were some frequency conflicts that had to be resolved. And these last two, H and J, are specialized projects, work task groups by the IEEE trying to resolve these frequency conflicts. We'll take a break here at this point, and we'll pick up with more wireless network engineering. Continuing with our lessons on wireless networks, let's nail down a few terms, a few definitions. The first term we're going to look at is called the cell. The cell is the collection of wireless clients that are associated and also the wireless access point if there is a wireless access point present. So these have a communication session established between themselves, and that collection of nodes, wireless nodes, are considered the cell. Now, we have two different structures, if you will, for the wireless cell. The first one is called an ad hoc network. And this would be the collection of wireless clients without a wireless access point. They associate to one another and form their own cell without any sort of centralized controller or moderation. And the administrative tasks of maintaining the cell, the communication sessions amongst themselves, is traded off from one node to another over time so that each node eventually shares some of the burden, the responsibility, if you will, for maintaining the communication sessions. Now, if we add the wireless access point to this environment, we now have something called an infrastructure wireless network. And this is the way most of our wireless networks operate. This would be where we have perhaps a hotspot, like at the Starbucks coffee shop, and that includes the wireless access point that has a wired connection. This is an Ethernet connection, typically to the internet. And that would be the example of this hotspot. And then, of course, the clients, the customers that go into this coffee shop would associate to that wireless access point and form the cell at this hotspot. And in the corporate environment, more the enterprise environment, the Ethernet connection to the access point or access points would plug into the wired infrastructure for the enterprise. This would be the collection of servers, file servers, print servers, application servers, etc., the network resources that the workers in the enterprise need to access over time. So the clients then would associate with that access point and then would be given connectivity to the networked resources, the wired resources in the enterprise. Now let's learn a couple more terms. These are the signaling schemes that have been used historically. The first one was introduced in 802.11, and it's called frequency hopping spread spectrum. And this allowed one data stream. In other words, it was kind of like a baseband network, only one data stream to carry your data. This was used in, as I said, the early 802.11 specification gave us 1 to 2 megabits of throughput. And this is also the technology that is used by Bluetooth. Bluetooth networks still today use frequency hopping spread spectrum. The next step up is called direct sequence spread spectrum. This still provides only one data stream, but allowed our data throughput to increase to about 11 megabits. So it's a little more efficient on its communications. So that got us to 802.11b is where we were first introduced to DSSS. Now, 802.11g and 802.11a use orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, OFDM. And that increased the number of data streams from 1 up to 48 data streams. And this allows us that huge jump in throughput from the 11 megabits at 802.11b to 54 megabits that we see with 802.11a and 802.11g. And now the latest family of wireless networking uses multiple input, multiple output called MIMO. And basically this allows us the use of several transmitters and simultaneously several receivers, and then of course each transmitter and receiver has to be attached to an antenna. So we have multiple antenna as well. Now this takes the orthogonal frequency division multiplexing and multiplies it by 2 or 3 or 4 or all the way up to 8 transmitters and 8 receivers and 8 antenna in the new draft specification 802.11ac. Another area of technology that we need to understand are the frequency ranges that we operate within using our wireless networking. Now, here in the United States, our Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, administers and allocates the frequency spectrum. There are 2 frequency ranges that the FCC has allocated for wireless communications, such as wireless networking here in the United States. Now, while this is definitely a U.S.-centric body, this Federal Communications Commission, recognize that other countries have their own equivalent of our FCC that is responsible for the frequency allocation in their countries. And they don't always agree. They don't always line up. We do have a couple of problems where we've allocated frequency spectrum to wireless networking here in the U.S., and the devices that are manufactured here, when we take them to Japan or to Europe, for example, interfere with their frequency allocations. They might use it for satellite communications or for emergency broadcast communications, things along these lines. So there have been a few wrinkles that we've had to sort out relative to these frequency spectrums. But let's look at these 2 specifically. The first one is called the Industrial, Scientific, and Medical Frequency Band, the ISM band, and it operates in a range of 2.4 gigahertz to 2.5 gigahertz. Now, that's the local area network frequency band, and it was used in 802.11, 802.11b, and 802.11g. So those 3 standards all operate in this 2.4 gigahertz frequency range, the ISM frequency range. However, so do microwave ovens, so do wireless telephones in the home, so do many other research components. In other words, there's a lot of interference. There's a lot of traffic in this frequency range, and as a result, you might have poor communications poor network throughput because of the interference in this 2.4 to 2.5 gigahertz frequency spectrum. So because of its crowdedness, sometimes we have problems or diminished throughput. So to solve this problem, the FCC had also allocated the region between 5 and 6 gigahertz, called the Unlicensed National Information Interchange Frequency Band, or the UNI band. There isn't much happening in this frequency range. This was really intended for nothing but wireless networking. And as a result, it's very uncrowded. The kicker, though, is you need different radios, different transmit and receive radios to operate in this 5 gigahertz frequency range. Now, this was defined by 802.11a that requires the 5 gigahertz radios. Let's also discuss quickly the 802.11n and 802.11ac standards. The 802.11n would be at least the G frequency range at 2.4 gigahertz, multiple transmitters, multiple receivers, multiple antenna, but may also include the A radios as well. So the N by itself doesn't exactly specify whether it's the 2.4 gigahertz or the 5 gigahertz. This is something you're going to have to carefully look at in your specifications for the devices you're interested in. However, the 802.11ac is focusing more heavily on the 5 gigahertz frequency range because it is going to use up to 8 transmitters and 8 receivers and 8 antenna. They have the opportunity now to isolate into this very non-crowded frequency spectrum. We'll take a break at this point and pick up with more wireless networking. Continuing with our lessons on wireless networking, let's take a look at the security that was first introduced with our 802.11 original wireless networking standard. Because wireless communications are nothing but emanations, in other words, all of your data is being broadcast into the air using electromagnetic radio frequency signals, it's very easy for a bad guy, an attacker, to pick up these radio frequency signals and perhaps steal your data, or perhaps use their knowledge that they learn from the communications they're stealing to break into the wired network behind the access points. In other words, now accessing the corporate network with the valuable resources. So even with the original 802.11, this vulnerability in wireless networks was understood, and they introduced some security called Wired Equivalent Privacy, or WEP. And the notion was make the wireless network at least as private, secure, as the wired network. So that was the goal of WEP. Now the kicker was WEP was developed by radio frequency engineers, the IEEE, and they weren't exactly the right guys for implementation of this strong authentication and strong encryption for the wireless networks. WEP was fraught with vulnerabilities and flaws. Now, WEP supported the use of a pre-shared key. In other words, authentication was based on a password. Or you could turn off this authentication process, and it was called open authentication, which means that we will accept anybody's request to associate with the access point. In other words, you don't even need to know the password. So it also then used encryption for the data communication. Once you were authenticated, it would use a RC4 symmetric key stream cipher for encrypting your data stream and providing confidentiality services. In other words, the bad guy only sees ciphertext, and that doesn't make any sense to him, and he doesn't know how to decrypt that ciphertext. So he can't understand the communications. While he's able to capture them, they're all encrypted, and he can't read it. Another security component that WEP supported was called MAC address filtering. The MAC address, of course, is a layer 2 address that is hard encoded into the wireless network interface card. In other words, each wireless NIC has its own globally unique address. And if you are the administrator for the access point, then you can build a list called a whitelist of the MAC addresses that are authorized on your network. And only those MAC addresses will be allowed to associate with the access point. There are problems with this all over the place. First, everybody used the same password. Everybody in the cell knew the same password and used that same password not just for authentication, but that password was the encryption key for the data flow. And that meant that anybody who knew the password could decrypt your communications. So we don't have a one-to-one secure channel. The cell is kind of secure. But then the kicker was the password was too short. It was too easy to crack. So a bad guy using a special cracking tool called WebCrack could steal the password, reveal the password in just a matter of seconds. And as a result of revealing the password, not only could he associate with the access point and gain access to the wired infrastructure back behind, he could also use that same password to decrypt all of your communications. So this was extremely weak stuff. In addition, it was the access point that said, hey, user, what's the password? And the user would provide the password. So the client is authenticated, but the client never was able to authenticate the access point. Is this really the correct access point? You see, a bad guy can stand up his own wireless access point, give it the same SSID, and spoof the legitimate wireless access point for the enterprise. So the legitimate client can't tell whether or not he's associating with the true access point for the enterprise or whether it's a rogue access point that some bad guy set up because there was no way to validate the identity of that access point. And it's easy to set up a rogue access point. Now that we understand we've all got this same common password and it's got vulnerabilities and it's easy for the bad guy to crack it, one of the things you would do is you would rotate that password, change that password regularly to make the bad guy crack it again and crack it again and crack it again as you rotate the key from one to the next to the next. Well, the problem is it was very difficult to coordinate everybody in the cell to change their key. There was no automatic way to do this. If you change the password on the access point, you'd have to now communicate out with all those users of the cell and give them that new password. And how do you do that now that you've changed the password on the access point? So maybe before you change the password on Monday, we're all going to use this new password. Boom, you have to send it out to 200 people. And the problem is when you send out the same password to that many people, a bad guy can steal a copy of the message one way or another, and boom, he's right back in. So there was no easy way to change those passwords and encryption keys. Because of all these understood vulnerabilities, a new standard was developed called 802.11i that was the replacement for WEP, and it improved the security from WEP to a more acceptable standard. So we'll take a break at this point and we'll pick up with Wi-Fi Protected Access, the 802.11i series. Continuing with our lessons in wireless security, we're going to quickly review 802.11i and then move forward. 802.11i was the replacement for the flawed security called Wired Equivalent Privacy, or WEP. There was an initial phase called WPA, Wi-Fi Protected Access, that was supposed to be nothing more than a firmware upgrade for that older 802.11 hardware. Eventually, the expectation was that you would have to replace that older hardware with new hardware that was more powerful and supported the stronger WPA2 Wi-Fi Protected Access version 2, and it's also called the Robust Secure Network. Again, the initial phase, WPA, was a transition phase that should have ended somewhere around 2006 to 2008, and we should all be running WPA2 today. Now, what is this Wi-Fi thing? What are we talking about? This is called the Wireless Fidelity Alliance. This is an alliance of the vendors, the manufacturers that produce wireless networking hardware. And the kicker was there was the standard from IEEE called 802.11 that was basically the definition of specifications. And then it was up to the vendors to interpret those specifications and build hardware that satisfied those specifications. And in the early days of wireless networking, each vendor was off doing their own thing with their own special bells and whistles, and none of the hardware was interoperable with other vendors' hardware. So the Wi-Fi Alliance came together. The vendors agreed, listen, we need to all be consistent so that if you buy a Cisco access point, you can use a Netgear wireless network interface card and vice versa. And they should still interoperate fully with all the specifications satisfied. So that's what the Wi-Fi Alliance is all about. It's the vendors of the gear, and the Alliance is designed to be sure that all the gear they produce, while it still may have those proprietary bells and whistles, it still is 100% satisfying the specs and interoperable with the other Wi-Fi Alliance certified gear. And the Wi-Fi Alliance read the spec called 802.11i for advanced security in wireless networks, and then introduced WPA and WPA2 to satisfy those heightened security needs. And as a reminder, we had both the personal authentication and security and the enterprise authentication and security. And the personal for home use that simply relied on a password for authentication, whereas the enterprise level requires more infrastructure like a Radius server and some back-end user database for authentication, authorization, and the accounting/auditing functions. Now, again, as we said, WPA should no longer be in use. It uses something called the Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or TKIP. Now, TKIP utilized the original 802.11 encryption algorithm called RC4, asymmetric key stream cipher, and it satisfies one of the problems in this regard in that it provides for easy key rotation and automatic key rotation. If you recall, in WEP, the keys were static and there was no easy way to rotate those keys or change those passwords. TKIP satisfies that problem with automatic key rotation. In addition, it uses message integrity code to validate that the communications haven't been corrupted or tampered with. It uses a unique key pair called pairwise keys so that each discrete user has his own secure channel with the access point, and no other user can decrypt his content. So it's just a two-key relationship. The access point holds one encryption/decryption key. The individual user holds his own. A second user would have a different key pair with the access point. A third user would have a different key pair with the access point. So each user has his own secure channel with the access point. However, because there are a lot of broadcasts that all the nodes need to be able to understand, there also is a group-wise key pair for broadcasts. So if the access point or a node was going to send out a broadcast, it would encrypt it using the group-wise key, and then everybody in the cell associated with the same SSID and access point would be able to decrypt that broadcast. However, if the client is sending a file to some file server on the back end, the wireless channel between the wireless client and the wireless access point, this not being a broadcast, would use the pairwise encryption key, and none of the other nodes would be able to decrypt that communication. That's WPA and TKIP specifically. Now, WPA also included the Extensible Authentication Protocol, which supports the use of digital certificates and potentially other authentication mechanisms. The important one for us here in wireless is the X.509 digital certificates used in a public key infrastructure. So EAP was added to the authentication scheme for WPA to support use of these digital certificates for both authentication and strong encryption. And it also supports the use of 802.1x port-based authentication. That says the access point will allow anybody to communicate with the back-end systems for authentication purposes only. But only after you get authenticated will the access point allow those clients to communicate with the network with data communications. So authentication communications for anybody and everybody, and only after you're successfully authenticated will the access point allow communications for data flow. That's some good, strong improvements over WEP. Now, the WPA2, also called the Robust Secure Network, or RSN, improves upon this tremendously. Remember, this required a hardware upgrade. In other words, throw away your old access points, throw away your old wireless network interface cards, and you have to replace them with new gear, because the computational demands of the Advanced Encryption Standard, that's the AES, are heavier than that for RC4, the original encryption algorithm. And as a result, we needed beefier hardware. So throw away your old hardware and buy new hardware. Now you can do WPA2. And as of 2006, all the Wi-Fi certified gear supports WPA2. So WPA2 is where we should all be operating today. and it includes the use of the Advanced Encryption Standard. This is currently the NIST recommendation for protecting confidential information. As a matter of fact, AES has been approved for use with secret and top secret sensitive content. In addition, WPA2 includes the use of CBC-MAC, that's Cipher Block Chaining Message Authentication Code, for integrity validation of the data to prove that the communications haven't been either corrupted or tampered with willfully by some bad guy. It also includes the use of the Extensible Authentication Protocol, as was WPA, and also the use of 802.1x port-based authentication that supports all users, no matter who they are, can communicate to the authentication system for the purposes of authentication, but only after successful authentication will any user be allowed to access data and allow data flow over the wireless network. We'll pause now and we'll pick up shortly. In this lesson, we're going to review the 802.11i enterprise level of security for wireless networks. As we see in the diagram on the left-hand side, we have the client wireless computer, and in the model, this is referred to as the supplicant. So the client is called the supplicant. Now, at this point, the client is a wireless client but hasn't yet authenticated or associated with the access point. And we're going to talk through this whole process. So at this point, the supplicant is going to identify an SSID for an access point nearby, and he is going to request authentication and association of the wireless access point. That is referred to as the authenticator. So the access point is called the authenticator because he moderates the cell. He's responsible for negotiating this authentication with the client. Now, the authenticator or the access point is going to use 802.1x port-based authentication back to the authentication system for the enterprise. And any client is allowed to use the wireless network for the attempted authentication process. But only those that are authenticated are allowed to actually flow data over the wireless network. So as you notice, behind that wireless access point off to the right, we see two paths. One goes up towards the Extensible Authentication Protocol, and the other one goes to sort of a switch. Now, this is a logical switch, not so much a mechanical switch as it's diagrammed here. Consider that's a logical switch, and that functions within the access point that supports 802.1x port-based authentication. So the supplicant wirelessly communicates with the authenticator, the access point, and says, hey, I'd like to authenticate and associate. The access point reaches back to the radius server behind the firewall. This is part of your infrastructure for the enterprise. And that radius server says, well, hand him my digital certificate. Now, this is an X.509 digital certificate, a component of a public key infrastructure. And that certificate provides strong authentication and the functionality of strong confidentiality or encryption services. So the radius server, which could be a TACAX server or today could also be a diameter server, that radius server sends that digital certificate over the wire back to the access point. Now the access point transmits that digital certificate over to the supplicant in a wireless fashion. And if a bad guy is able to sniff that or steal that, that's no threat. That's no problem. If the bad guy would like a certificate, we'll give him his own copy because he can do me no harm just by having my certificate. Basically, he can prove my identity, and that's about it. And that's no harm to me. So we hand the certificate over to the supplicant, who at that point will validate the certificate. There's probably 10 or 15 validation tests for the certificate. And once the supplicant is comfortable that the certificate is true and just and valid and actually represents the network that he's trying to associate with, the supplicant will generate two symmetric session keys and pull the public key off the digital certificate. Now it takes that public key from the digital certificate and encrypts one copy of the symmetric session key. Now, it's only the radius server who has the associated private key for that public key encryption. So if the public key encrypts it, only the private key can decrypt it, and only the radius server holds that private key. So it's the only system in the entire world that could decrypt this symmetric session key that the supplicant just created. Now, the supplicant sends that encrypted copy of the symmetric session key back through the wireless network to the access point. If a bad guy steals that key, it doesn't matter because it's encrypted and the bad guy can't decrypt it. So the encrypted symmetric session key is transmitted wirelessly to the access point. The access point puts it on the Ethernet wire up through the EAP over to the Radius server, who uses his private key and decrypts the symmetric session key. What we have just accomplished is now the supplicant has a copy of a symmetric session key, and the Radius server has another copy of that same exact symmetric session key. And now we've established what we call an SSL tunnel. Now, when the client is transmitting anything to the Radius server, he's going to encrypt it with his key, and the Radius server can decrypt it with his key. So everything from the supplicant to the Radius server is encrypted using these symmetric session keys. The Radius server, now that he has the SSL channel established with the supplicant, that's over the wireless and the wired connection between those two, challenges the supplicant for some form of authentication. What authentication mechanisms do you support? We support this as well, whatever they negotiate upon. So over this encrypted SSL tunnel, the supplicant and the Radius server negotiate authentication mechanisms, and once they choose, in this example, we're using X.509, implemented in Microsoft's Active Directory. The supplicant says, well, I'm a Microsoft client, and the Radius server says, great, we've got a Microsoft database back here, we'll get you authenticated that way. And now through the SSL tunnel, they'll run through the MS Chat, Microsoft Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol version 2, and authenticate the client, the supplicant, through the SSL tunnel. Now, once that client gets successfully authenticated, Active Directory notifies the Radius server, yes, his authentication is valid, this is his username, these are the groups he's a member of, and the Radius server will define the security policy called the Remote Access Service Policy for that client, and will notify the access point of the conditions of this supplicant's particular session. And if the supplicant violates any of these session parameters, the access point is to disassociate that client. In other words, he just misbehaved, kill his connection. So using this RAS policy, we can strongly control what the user does. And if the user doesn't do everything that the policy requires, the authenticator will simply disallow his communications any further. What types of rules can we have? We can have what is his username, what is his group affiliation, what time of day, what day of week, what protocols is he using? Is he encrypting everything through a VPN? We'll talk about that in a few moments. So far, there is no VPN. We'll also require perhaps how long he's allowed to be on the wire, how long he is allowed to be idle, and then we're going to cut him off just because he's wasting our time, et cetera, et cetera. So there are 20, 30, 50, 80 rules that we can impose on that client's session. And if any one of those rules are violated, disconnect that client. Now that Radius server notifies the access point what these rules are and says he is now authenticated. So the access point will now close that switch that we talked about. This is the 802.1x port-based authentication. We'll close that switch and will allow that client to communicate with the LAN-based resources, actually flowing data back and forth between the client and the resources and the client. However, before we allow that client to do any of that, the access point and the client will negotiate either WPA or WPA2. Hopefully today it's all WPA2. And they will establish a secure connection over the wireless component of the connection. In other words, from the supplicant to the authenticator, we're going to encrypt all this with the advanced encryption standard with CBC MAC and counter mode protocol. And that channel where the lightning bolt is shown there is going to be encrypted. However, the wire behind the access point at this moment is not going to be encrypted yet. Unless our policy set by the Radius server, unless the policy requires a VPN, the client could now communicate where it's clear text on that Ethernet cable behind the access point. At this point, we no longer need that SSL channel between the client and the Radius server. The authentication system and process has already completed. Destroy the SSL tunnel and throw away those symmetric session keys for authentication purposes. However, we've now regenerated a new key pair for the secure communications between the supplicant and the authenticator. And now, if the Radius server required it in his policy, or if the client simply chooses to do so, what should occur is the client should make his first data packet a request for a VPN through the access point, through that switch that is now closed, through the firewall, and to a VPN concentrator or VPN server of some form. And now the wire behind the access point has been encrypted as well. And we have actually two layers of encryption in the wireless section. We have the AES for WPA2, and we also now have the VPN that the client has established with the VPN server. This is how an enterprise-level wireless network should be configured. And this is one example. There are variations to this, but this is kind of a classic basic implementation of 802.11i, WPA or WPA2 in the enterprise. We'll knock off here and we'll pick up with more wireless networking. This lesson will cover some attacks on wireless networks. Let's first look at this first term called war driving. This is where a potential attacker, potential bad guy, sets up usually a laptop computer with a wireless network interface card and some form of GPS so that the laptop is geographically located properly on a map. And a bad guy would then either walk or drive through an area and fire up a war driving application. Kismet is one, for example. It's a Linux-based utility that will sync up this GPS, and it will simply sense all the wireless access points that it can identify. Anything that is broadcasting an SSID, its beacon, if you will, the application for war driving will record that SSID and all other network parameters it can identify, and then place a marker on the map where that access point was located. And so a bad guy will simply drive around town on a sunny afternoon and be mapping out all these wireless access points. Now, he doesn't have to pay any attention. This is all automatic once he's got the right pieces in place. And then later, he'll go back to someplace comfortable for him, and he will simply poke around on the map and identify juicy targets. So this was a way of identifying where do I want to break in, and it'll identify the low-hanging fruit, the very non-secure wireless networks and the juicy wireless networks where while there might be security, the value might be very high and it might be worth some effort. So war driving is simply a map where these access points are and as many details as can be gleaned from just a simple anonymous survey of the terrain. This has been pretty well accomplished all throughout the United States and then some, perhaps globally, if you will. And it's published on a website called Wiggle, W-I-G-L-E, if I recall correctly. If you nose around for this, you can identify all the access points in a certain area based on the latest war driving analysis. The next one down is called war chalking. Once we identify the parameters for somebody else's network, if it's an easy target or something along these lines, I might spray paint some details on their building, on the wall or the sidewalk or the curb, so that when I'm in this neighborhood the next time, I know an easy network to get into to give me some free internet connectivity, for example. This is sort of a cryptic marking that we're going to put on the wall or the building that identifies these network parameters, because I don't necessarily want everybody to understand what I'm communicating. I don't want the victim to know that we've been able to identify the nature of his network and details about how to connect into it. So very often there are symbols that the bad guys, if you will, have defined and now commonly used to mark these details about the wireless network for easy access to this network in an unauthorized fashion. The next one is referred to as WEP cracking. Now, if you recall, WEP was the original security called Wired Equivalent Privacy for the 802.11 network. However, it was horribly flawed, and as a result, it can be cracked in just a matter of seconds. And breaking into a WEP network is referred to as WEP cracking. And there's a tool called WEP Crack that allows you to do this. Now, because wireless communications are radio frequency waves, electromagnetic waves that are transmitted into the air, anybody with a receiver can sense those waves. And we simply can eavesdrop on the wireless network. This is referred to as sniffing. And if the network isn't using encryption, then it's all clear text and it's all free and easy for me to read. And even if it is encrypted, I might start to attack that encryption and be able to decrypt packets and be able to steal their sensitive data. Now, defeat the authentication scheme. Let's say I figure out the authentication password for a network. This very often will allow me, the bad guy, to break into and gain access to the wired infrastructure behind the access point. And very often this isn't just a connection straight out to the internet. There will be servers with files and other resources that are available, and I can gain access to that wired network. Now, the last two on this list, we're going to move to the next slide and talk about them, called a rogue access point and man in the middle. So moving forward, let's look at the next slide, and we'll see a diagram that's going to show this rogue access point. That's this access point right in the center of the screen down towards the bottom. He's the attacker, and this is going to be to implement a man-in-the-middle attack. So here's the way this works. The bad guy simply acquires an access point. Now, access points are dirt cheap. You can buy an access point for $10, $20 on the internet. And it is as legitimate an access point as the enterprise level access point that your corporation might have spent $200 or $500 for. And the client can't tell the difference between the legitimate access point sponsored by the corporation and the bad guy's access point. So the client can't tell which one is real without stronger authentication mechanisms in place. And that's what allowed this man-in-the-middle attack to occur. So the bad guy stands up his own rogue access point. Now, this is an unauthorized piece of hardware in the network, and we should be searching for these on a regular basis and sorting them out, and then reprimanding or perhaps some other form of penalizing the person who implemented this access point. This should be against company policy, and there should be punishment associated with standing up your own access point in the enterprise. So the bad guy stands up his own rogue access point, and he configures his service set identifier. Remember, that's the name of the wireless network. He sets that SSID to the same as the legitimate access point that the enterprise set up. So let's say the legitimate corporation is called Boboville. That's the SSID. The attacker will set that same SSID Boboville on his wireless access point. And now, if he can position his access point closer to the client's because his signal is stronger than the legitimate access point signal, the clients will preferentially associate with the rogue access point. And of course, the bad guy is going to say, yes, of course I'll let you authenticate and associate. Yes, you're the guy, because he wants that client to think he is the legitimate access point for Boboville. Now, at the same time, what the attacker is going to do is he will associate with the legitimate access point. And typically he'll do this by stealing a credential, and he'll pretend that he is the legitimate client associating with the legitimate access point. But again, he's not. He's the bad guy. And now what happens is the client thinks he is actually communicating with the legitimate access point, and the legitimate access point thinks he is communicating with the legitimate client, but everything is being channeled through that man in the middle, allowing him to violate the confidentiality. He can steal the secrets. It also allows him to violate the integrity. He can manipulate the data, and it also can allow him to violate the availability of the communications. He can simply choose not to forward the communications on. So the bad guy simply receives it from the client and pumps it up to the access point after he's viewed it and manipulated it at his discretion. And when the access point responds, the access point sends it back to the middleman, the attacker, and allows the attacker to view it and to compromise it however he cares to. And if he chooses to, he can forward it back onto the user thinking, this is the legitimate response from the legitimate access point. So this is the rogue access point and the man in the middle, a relatively easy attack to accomplish in the wireless network. This is why we need to strengthen our security for wireless networks. These should be considered hazardous. As you notice in the diagram, there's a firewall isolating the access point from the resources on the corporate LAN. This should be a standard component of any wireless network implementation. We'll take a break at this point and move forward in the wireless networking lessons. In this lesson on wireless networks, we're going to review the baseline recommended security for wireless networks. Let's start with changing the default service set identifier. Typically, if the SSID is still set to the original default SSID, this is an indication of a non-configured wireless access point, which means security is at a bare minimum. So always change that SSID from the original to something new. And you should also at that same time set an administrator username and a strong password for the administrator account for that access point. Next, try to choose an uninteresting and unprovocative service set identifier. I've seen SSIDs that say, "Come hack me." Well, you know what? You're just challenging the bad guy. You're asking the bad guy to come break into your network. You don't want to set up Bobo's wine and tequila store because now you're also identifying to perhaps the alcoholic type of attacker. This is a juicy target. Or Bobo's gold and diamond store. Well, man, there's a lot of valuables there. Maybe I can figure out how to defeat his security system physically and break in and steal all the gold and diamonds. So you want some unprovocative and uninteresting service set identifier in general. Now, if you're a hotspot, then of course you want your SSID to be broadcasted and you want it to be something interesting to bring people in. That's a different story. But from an enterprise level, you want this to be kind of generic and uninteresting. Turn off the SSID broadcast if you can. Again, if you're providing services to the public, like in a conference room in your office or some hotspot at Starbucks, then you need to leave your SSID broadcast on because you're trying to attract those clients. However, in the enterprise, all of those wireless client nodes should know the SSID. If not, make it part of the policy and part of the training. If you want to connect your device to our wireless, here's how you do it, but that's only for the trusted employees. If you can implement MAC address filtering. Now, I say that. The point is, the only way you can implement MAC address filtering is if there is a finite collection of nodes that you trust and you only want those nodes to be able to use your wireless network. In most cases, MAC address filtering isn't possible because I have to support too many different nodes. It might be a cell phone, it might be a laptop, it might be some pad device. They kind of come and they go, and I can't keep track of all the approved MAC addresses, so I can't keep this list updated. Next, if possible, implement WPA2, which includes the use of the Advanced Encryption Standard Encounter Mode and the use of cipher block changing message authentication code for data integrity validation. You want to implement enterprise authentication if possible. Now, home users don't have Radius servers and directory services available typically, and as a result, they would use the personal level or home level of authentication and encryption. However, if you've got an enterprise class wireless network, you should have these resources available, and if not, you should get them going because you have greater losses potentially if a bad guy does break in. You need this stronger level of security. You want to implement mutual and multi-factor authentication for these wireless clients. In other words, not only do I need to prove to the client that he's associating with the correct network, I need him to prove to me that he's the right client. So that's called mutual authentication, where we authenticate each other. And then in addition, I might make him use his password along with rapidly changing password, one-time password, if you will, from a token device, for example. So multi-factor authentication is the use of two different authentication mechanisms, something you know, something you have, something you are. I might say a thumbprint and a password for multi-factor authentication. Now, another way we can help to secure our wireless environment is to not propagate our wireless signal any further than I need to cover. In other words, if I don't intend to support wireless clients in the parking lot, try to tune my signal, my wireless signal, so I'm not propagating a great deal of power into the parking lot. Now, this cell shaping is what it's called, is probably your weakest form of security because a bad guy with a good antenna can connect to your wireless network from hundreds of yards and maybe even miles and miles away. So this cell shaping is very weak. Basically, you're knocking down the dummies here once again. If they really have the intent to break into your wireless network, cell shaping probably isn't going to help you. But if I don't need to propagate a strong signal into the parking lot or the building next to me or the football field, then I can shape my cell to focus the energy where I do want coverage and minimize the energy where I don't want coverage. Always treat your wireless network and segments as hostile. Always isolate the access points from the corporate LAN through a firewall. Isolate them, separate them, and then filter that traffic heavily. And anything outside that firewall on the wireless segments should be considered bad guys, potentially. So I'll always treat them with the utmost scrutiny, stronger authentication, stronger encryption, etc., etc. And then finally, always require a VPN for data transmission. We talked about the use of a Radius server and a policy that says the user is only allowed to send encrypted data. Now, what that says is he can authenticate using the 802.1x port-based authentication. Anybody can. And he can send data, but before he sends any real data, he must first establish an encrypted channel with a VPN server of our choosing, and it has to satisfy these encryption standards. So all data that the user is going to transmit over the wireless network must be encrypted with the VPN. And that would be another component of strong security for the wireless network. Now moving forward, let's take a quick look at the structure or the architecture for the wireless network. Top left, we see the public internet, that very hostile, untrusted, wild, wild west environment for networking. And that's where all the bad guys live. And then we see what we call classically our demilitarized zone or our perimeter network, which hosts our public services. This would be our web server, email server, DNS server, FTP server, whatever else I want to expose to the public internet. I put them out there in that DMZ. And I also consider that area to be hostile, and I also consider it to be already compromised. And if you have that mindset about your DMZ, you understand what you should and should not put out there in your DMZ. Nothing valuable, because if you assume the bad guy already owns that space, you already realize you don't want to put anything of value out there. Now, back behind that DMZ, those two firewalls, we see the corporate LAN, and this is our more trusted computing environment. And we have the general corporate LAN, that's where the bulk of our resources live. But then you'll also notice I have two segments that are spawned off, accounting and R&D. These are where I have high-value information assets, and I want to protect them further, more staunchly, and limit access. And I'll do that with a controlling firewall, that security device that segregates but also joins these segments together. So now I've isolated those two high-value segments for accounting, all my financial data, and R&D, all my new inventions and stuff like this. I isolate them and control communications in and out of those segments very carefully. Now down below, this is the area of interest for wireless networking, we see another firewall, and only out there is where we put our access point. Don't ever put the access point on the corporate LAN directly, because you have to assume, because I can't physically see this guy, he doesn't have to physically be in my building, he might be a bad guy and I'll never know. So I'm going to treat everybody attached to my wireless networks as potentially a bad guy. And only if he authenticates properly using my strong authentication, and only if he follows all the rules of my policy, will I allow him to communicate through the firewall to the corporate LAN where I have my valuable resources. So as you can see, we consider the wireless segments as hostile as the internet. And with this, you have your head on straight about the security or lack thereof of your wireless networking environment. We'll take a break here and pick up where we left off. In this lesson, we're going to continue with a look at wireless networking, and we're going to explore the newer technologies called multiple input, multiple output technologies, as defined by 802.11n and the new draft specification called 802.11ac. Now, the point behind MIMO, this multiple input, multiple output, is to improve data rates and improve distances with your wireless networking capabilities. As you recall, with 802.11g and A, we had up to 54 megabits data rate. However, with 802.11n, we can operate up to about 600 megabits. That's 10 times the throughput of the A and G wireless networks. Now, how do we get this increased throughput? Well, we do this by using multiple transmitters and multiple receivers and multiple antenna in a single access point. And then each of these transmitter-receiver pairs can be used to communicate 48 or more data streams simultaneously. And this is how we increase this throughput. We also, using some very powerful circuitry called digital signal processors, can take advantage of what had earlier been a problem called multipathing, which was kind of interference. Now we can actually take advantage of that interference, that secondary reflected signal, and actually intelligently add that reflection, which prior was interference, and add it to the original signal intelligently and boost that original signal. So this multipathing capability and the multiple transmitters, receivers, and antenna help us improve this data rate. Another component of this is I can't put these antennas super close to one another, so I have to spread them out a little bit. And that's why we might see a wireless access point with multiple antenna and they're separated. This is referred to as spatial diversity. And this spatial diversity is a key component of this multipathing phenomenon that I described, which now is being used to our advantage on our data rates. Another component of this is I can use these multiple antenna that are spatially diverse and use phase shift steering and create what we call a phased array, tending to focus the energy in a specific direction to increase the distance of transmission in that direction. In other words, those waves recombine from those multiple antenna at some specific point way out there in the distance. And this is called a phased array and helps us improve the distances that we can transmit our wireless signals. As you recall, with 802.11, A, B, and G, we got to about 100 meters or so with our wireless networks. Well, today we can go more than 100 meters, hundreds of meters, and even miles or tens of miles with our wireless communications. A great deal of data throughput and distance associated with 802.11n MIMO. Now, 802.11n is where we are currently, and we are just moving into the newer 802.11ac. We'll cover that guy in a minute. Now, the 802.11n can utilize either the 2.4 gigahertz, that's the industrial, scientific, and medical frequency band, or it can use the unlicensed National Information Interchange band, the UNI band, up at 5 gigahertz. It's much less crowded up at 5 gigahertz. In other words, there's much less interference operating between 5 and 6 gigahertz as there is down in the ISM band, the 2.4 gigahertz. So we can take advantage of one or the other or both of those frequency spectrums in our 802.11n access points and clients. Of course, you have to understand what it is you're buying when you're buying that gear, and you're buying your network interface cards for the clients. You need to be sure that they're all either 2.4 or 5 or both sets of radios. You want them all to be kind of synchronized. So this 802.11n is forming the basis of our upcoming 4G cellular communications. Now, 4G, many people think their cell phones are already operating at 4G. That's a marketing lie. It's a fallacy, if you will. And they basically wanted to sell new hardware. There are improvements in 3G, so it's better than 3G, but it's nowhere near 4G. So they lobbied, petitioned, and eventually found their way to calling it 4G long-term evolution, LTE, and that's where we are today. It's an advancement over 3G, but it is nowhere near true 4G cellular. So when I refer to 4G, I'm talking about true 4G, not the LTE version that we currently are running in many of our cell phones today. But this will be a core component of that true 4G cellular, or at least that's the thinking today, that will use 802.11n wireless networking along with whatever state of evolution we are with WiMAX, another wireless technology, and we combine all these together with the 4G cellular, the actual cellular communications, and that's how we'll satisfy the 4G data demands and reliability demands that the standard requires. The new MIMO specification is called 802.11ac. It's still in draft version, so it hasn't been ratified yet. And as a result, it still may move around a great deal. As a matter of fact, there is so much new technology that's coming into this arena in this particular type of technology that it's really the wild, wild west. It's really a shooting match out there. And the spec, though, is targeting somewhere between 2 and 8 radio transmitters and receivers, and somewhere between 2 and 8 antenna. And again, spatially diverse antenna. It just doubles the hardware requirements or specifications for 802.11n, which of course is going to further improve the data rate and the distances potential from these wireless access points. We're looking at gigabits of data throughput. And again, still it hasn't been ratified. The standards haven't been ratified yet. But we are really seeing tremendous improvement in the data rates and the distances. The 802.11ac is going to be isolated to only that uniband, that 5 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz frequency spectrum, because it is so unpopulated in that spectrum. That spectrum is really only for wireless networking, whereas the ISM frequency band not only is being used for wireless networking, but other sorts of wireless communications. And as a result, there's a whole lot of traffic there. Now, moving forward, let's do a quick review of our cellular services. We originally had our first generation cellular, which was voice only, and these used telephones that were something akin to a boom box you'd carry around on your shoulder almost, big, heavy devices, and they were analog. Second generation went to a digital telephone, digital network, and had some basic communication services like caller ID, paging, and basic email. But it wasn't fast and it wasn't easy. Now, the third generation is where we got kind of a big change in technology, and this is where our cell phones were always connected, they were digital, and we had decent data communications, but it still wasn't like true laptop or pad device. There was some connectivity, basic connectivity maybe to the internet, but it wasn't great. Finally, we're at fourth generation, or not quite fourth generation, 4G long-term evolution. This is a nice improvement over 3G, but it's nowhere near the standard for 4G. So 4G LTE is our current state of technology. We're getting hundreds of megabits in most cases where we get good connectivity, but that's where this falls short, is the connectivity. 4G says that your connection over the 4G cellular network should be as reliable as if you were attached with a hard wire, a cable, and our cellular services are nowhere near that. In addition, it says every client associated to a cell will get 100 megabits uplink and 100 megabits downlink simultaneously. Well, our cellular services can't provide that as well. So we're nowhere near true 4G, and we're currently running on this 4G long-term evolution, kind of a marketing lie to the public. They think they're on 4G, but they're really not on 4G. The way we're going to get to true 4G, if we can get there in the foreseeable future, is by using something called alternate MAC layer, that's the data link layer, layer 2 of the OSI model, and physical layer, that's layer 1 of the OSI model. So we're going to use alternate technologies in layer 1 and 2 of the OSI model in addition to the cellular services, and we combine all that together, and that's how we might get these high data rates and high reliability that is the requirement for the spec for 4G.